Hello, welcome. What's up? Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the Power of Story panel. I am extremely honored to introduce the panel. My name is Kamal Sinclair. I am the director of the New Frontier Lab programs at the Sundance Institute. And we've got makers of the new narrative up on stage. These are a group of incredible pioneers of the future of storytelling. Just one quick thing I want to give in terms of context. Something that New Frontier has been seeing for a while is as we start to see these artists, this incredible community of artists that are coming out of these emerging media technologies and telling stories, we're starting to be able to kind of very confidently claim that we think that this time, this last 30 years or so, is really a demarcation in the communication system where story lives. We've been used to 500 years of mass media, and that mass media changed our sense of reality as human beings. We saw Earth from space for the first time, and it changed our sense of what real is. We saw Vietnam from our living rooms and saw the front lines of war for the first time, and that changed us fundamentally. It changed how we had to perceive reality, and the artists stepped up to make meaning out of that disruption to our sense of reality. We had postmodernism and surrealism and Dadaism and all kinds of ways in which the artists and the philosophers tried to help us navigate this disruption to our reality. Well, we're at that point again. We are at a time where it's the most abundant, dynamic, and complicated communication system of human history, and the artists are showing up again to help us make sense of the ways that it's disrupting our sense of reality between bioengineering, augmented reality, immersive media, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the canvas of our communication going into billions of objects all around us. And thank goodness we have people like those that are on stage to help us navigate what does this mean for our reality. And with that, I want to thank Julia Kaginski, our moderator for this panel. She is one of the people that I have admired in the field. Yes, a bigger clap. She is a thought leader that I have deep respect for. She's founded New Ink at the New Museum. She's working with Bell Labs on their reinvigorating the EAT program. She comes out of the Creators Project, and she has brought more artists to the field that are helping us navigate this reality than I can name. And I just want to thank you for helping us with this conversation. And thanks to Dropbox for making all of this happen. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Kamal, for that warm and wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here with us today to talk about the new narrative revolution. We have an incredible panel of technologists, filmmakers, artists, musicians, comedians, dramaturgs here to talk about how new narrative formats and technologies are changing storytelling in all of these spaces. And I'm just curious to get to know the room a little bit. A lot of the folks here you might find in the New Frontier program of the festival. I'm curious how many of you are New Frontier diehards? Yeah? All right, show of hands. Great, okay. How many of you are newbies? You're here for the films, you're like, what is this new narrative revolution business? All right, okay. Very good. We're happy to have you guys. The purpose of this panel is to show you a bit of what's happening in the space from a really wide range of perspectives and practitioners, and also provide a little bit of inspiration. So yeah, with that, we're going to hear brief introductions from the panelists. They're going to talk about a project that they're really passionate about in their own work, that they're being inspired by. And we're going to have a discussion, and towards the end, we're going to open it up for questions from you. Today, we are really excited to have with us John Gaeta, who's an award-winning designer and innovator. He's SVP of creative strategy at Magic Leap, but you guys might know him as a groundbreaking technology designer from the Matrix trilogy. Yeah, do you remember that? John, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been up to at Magic Leap these days?
Sure. Well, I'm on this path, and it began a while back, and began with trying to depict concepts, some science fiction, some social fiction. And along the whole timeline, I've been sort of aiming to some degree towards the very thing that the concepts were about a long time ago. So I reached a bit of an inflection point a couple years back where I thought it might be interesting to go inside the sort of places where these new canvases, new platforms are being incubated, with the hope that you could influence the direction by painting a picture of the future, helping them to understand, for whom this could benefit, for whom this could inspire. So I've been at Magic Leap. There's a whole story we can unpack about them. They are a different kind of group. They are, to some degree, pirates on the seas of technology. It's a very interesting atmosphere, a very eclectic atmosphere. So my job is not necessarily to drill into one specific project. It's more to look at the where we might be going.
Mm. And you've really prefigured a lot of the XR experiments in augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, hollow cinema that we see today with some of your early work.
Yeah, so I was here before, in 2016 with close friends and colleagues from Lucasfilm and another group that we started a number of years back called ILM X Lab. And this was a fantastic group, actually, because it was the intersection of the story group, which was creating, the directions and roadmap for the universe and characters of Star Wars, because it was at Lucasfilm, and some, extreme technology inventor incubator types. And so we were here in 2016 with this installation called Hollow Cinema, which allowed you to step inside a full holographic immersive scene. In those days, it was a Star Wars moment. But that was an interesting, to be on the creator side or closest to the creators. But interestingly enough, with that experiment, there was a pairing of the new media form and platform-minded super engineers, and literally a direct link to the story group and the universe group. So that was an interesting time, and that was mostly what I was there to do, was to help during this sort of second Renaissance period for Lucasfilm, try to understand new forms and new places to build a universe.
Great. And I understand we have a short clip about some of your work with Magic Leap today. Can we play the clip?
We've been on a long journey. In fact, if this story were like most, we'd be reaching the part where we turn back home. But for us, there is no return, only what lies ahead. And that's a brand new way of thinking.
Computers are always this thing that you had to do inside the computer. So it's one of those notions that when you grow up, you're it's a question wouldn't it be cool if you could have computing spill outside the computer? Almost like an art project. I think Magic Leap really did start out like an art project first, and then it turned out maybe there's some science behind this, we can turn into something real, and it turned out there was. So that was really the interesting piece of it.
So Magic Leap have, the past 5-6 years, developing a lightweight wearable computing device using meshing and reading of a room. You place digital content in that room using eye tracking and head pose. We know where you're looking to actually place all of that digital content that we only ever experience now via a screen in the world with you.
To take the players off the screen and place them into our universe, into our known world, to have them interact with the furniture, to pass in and out of doors, are extraordinarily exciting potential.
Magic Leap is more than a headset. It's a new medium, one that brings together our physical and digital worlds. It's a computer that can see what you see and has the power to learn. It's the first step towards a new way to interact with the world.
I think what's really interesting for this group is you're thinking maybe a small application, or you might be thinking something to do in a room. It's like if you think about a whole city, let's say Los Angeles, and maybe there's going to be an amazing director who creates a whole week-long comic adventure over Los Angeles. That might be the entertainment layer. Other folks might want to work on the communication layer or health and wellness layers, which allows you to springboard into the infinite amount of new worlds you want to build.
Our story isn't over, and we're just getting started. See you in the Magicverse.
Great. One of the reasons I wanted to start with John in this panel, and not only because he's a pioneer, who's responsible for a lot of the technologies that we have today, from his work with The Matrix to Lucasfilm, Industrial Light and Magic, and now with Magic Leap, but also because these technologies are part of what's calling many storytellers of all kinds to try to invent new formats that really make use of the technology, or to realize stories that have previously been impossible to tell. And from there, I would love to hear from Sarah Ellis, who's an award-winning producer and the director of digital development at the Royal Shakespeare Company, who's here presenting a new piece that's actually utilizing the Magic Leap for the first time. Sarah, do you want to tell us a little bit?
Yeah, I think I've got some slides as well, which are always helpful. I'm Sarah, and I'm the Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And our playwright is 400 years old. And to quote another wonderful UK cultural icon, what my job is at the RSC is to bring together the people that believe in tomorrow belongs to those who see it coming, and bring that and wrap that around a set of stories that have been with us for those past 400 years, and look at what Shakespeare is now and what Shakespeare can be in the future. Some work we've done at the RSC has always been in collaboration. In 2016, we put live, real-time digital avatar performing on stage with live actors. This is Mark Quartley, who was the actor performing it, and using motion capture technology, we were able to create his character on stage. And a shot here of the avatar and Mark performing with the fantastic Simon Russell Beale as Prospero. We were able to explore this digital world and this live storytelling world, and for that opened up a set of possibilities on all the different places where we can tell stories today. And that fed into our latest collaboration with Magic Leap, which is at part of the New to Frontier program at Central, where for the first time for us, we have performed a speech of Shakespeare in volumetric capture. And again, converging that beautiful craft of physical live storytelling with sets and theatrical design, and bringing that theatrical expertise into this space, and we're sharing that here today. So as you can see, we always work with the people that have the superpowers that we may not currently have, but theatre is innovative, and there are quite innovators working in theatre every day, and it's how we bring that together. So our next collaboration, which I'm really excited about, doesn't just work with theatre, it works with all forms of live performance and storytelling, and for the next 2 years, we're embarking on a project called Audiences of the Future with Magic Leap and also Intel and Epic Games. But not only that, we're bringing in companies that we share audiences with, that we want to extend this curiosity and this achievement. We'll be working with the Philharmonia Orchestra, Punch Drunk, Marshmallow Laser Feast, who are also exhibiting here as part of the programme, and Manchester International Festival. And what we're hoping through that is we'll be looking at the real-time technology and seeing how we can have a presence here, all these places, working with these sorts of technologies, but working with the best technology there is, which is the actor, and how wonderful they are. But also all the home entertainment systems we have now, and all those surfaces for storytelling. And how can theatre hold those spaces? What does theatre have to say in those spaces? And how can we provide a form of connectivity where we're not saying either or, we're not saying you're different, that's not right. We're saying we want to be in the places where people are today. We want to make sure that theatre is a live component of that. And we also want to make sure that these stories really resonate with the bigger picture, the social, political, and what we're exhibiting today. And that's our home, and that's where we are every day, and that's where Stratford-upon-Avon and where all this ingenuity comes from. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always exciting to see how an art form as old and foundational as theater can, continuously reinvent itself and find new ways of telling 400-year-old stories. But I want to also stress that it's not just about technology. And the next panelist is incredibly innovative, and he's a writer, director, producer, and actor, Terence Nance. He is probably one of the most innovative storytellers out there today, but he's not necessarily, using the latest gadgets, right? It's innovation in storytelling is about playing around with format, with new perspectives, with the mixing of surreal and kaleidoscopic new forms and types of expression. And for anyone who's watched his HBO series, Random Acts of Flyness, yeah, I'm sure that's something that you'll recognize. Terence, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work and about what's been driving and inspiring you?
Sure. I guess what's been inspiring me today, what I've just been thinking about just today and while y'all were talking, is just catching up with the technology of the photograph, the idea of the photograph. Because, for me, I think I have not even psychologically or physiologically evolved to become equipped with the complexity of what a photograph presents, which is kind of the idea that you can have a moment that is coded as the quote unquote truth that happened, objectively happened, in a frame that has been determined by somebody else, those assumptions. And I think that a lot of what the show is about how to catch up with how far behind we are, the technology of the photograph, but how to catch up kind of in an alternate dimension, skip all the steps we would need to kind of catch up with what it means and how it operates on us, spiritually and psychologically. There's just thinking about the idea of the photograph, I think that, I don't know any of this, so, research it for yourself after, but I think it actually, if the photograph and photography are kind of different, if photography is getting the light and seeing whatever the light is bending and, creating as an image, and then the photograph is the object, the recording of the light, then, if you separate those two things, I think the actual photography or the light coming through a lens and then being projected on something happened hundreds of years before anybody figured out how to record it, the camera obscura and all that kind of stuff. And so understanding that came before it, that there was this idea that, we can project light and even just what light feels like to us psychologically, what it means emotionally, and having a foundational idea that like this 3D world could be made flat, upside down and reversed, whatever. I think that that's interesting to understand as like an emotional reality that was divorced from like the darkness that was necessary to create the conditions by which that light could be recorded onto an object. Because even that, like the whole like, it's silver halide, I think, or something that's geologically taken years to create, this chemical that you can then use to make a photograph. And I think that like, that the making of that object, that part of it is super unstable. And so like when we're making the show, I think we're trying to contend with the idea that, especially as Black people, as spirits, that we can be captured and framed, and that process is a geological process that we haven't caught up with, and that we have to kind of like abstract and master and dance with in a way that's going to be useful for us. And just even thinking about like that, those like the silver are some rocks that were in a cave somewhere at some point, probably in Europe. And even like the pictorial tradition of like cave drawings and things like that. So that's just what I've been thinking about today on the bus. And what y'all inspired me to talk, because I was thinking about what you were saying about like the technology of the actor, and like just as African descendant people, all of us being African descendant people, like the idea of performance as performance is the medium by which we tell stories, and what is the utility of performance, and how does that evolve independent of your ability to capture it somewhere, and how it evolved for millennia without the concept of capturing. But that's not actually true, because it was being captured. And like what mechanism were we using to capture it communally? It was like this sort of communal memory, or even like oral, you look like Judaism or whatever, like chanting and like the use of song to record performance, even as a kind of notation system. And so, I was just thinking about that, like the technology of that, how it's separate from the technology that would have developed in the caves as silver that create the ability to make the photograph. But I think the clip I have to show from the show is a little bit relevant to that, because it was a moment, it's the start of the 6th episode, which actually Stephanie is in. Stephanie's my landlord. So, just being hyper aware of what she was doing. That's
Did
true.
she give you a credit on rent with the appearance?
Still got to pay the rent. No, she was in the show in the last episode. It's just a fun fact, little thing. But this clip is from that episode, and I think it was the moment, a lot of collaborators on the episode are here. Sean Peters, DP, is right here, and Naeem Ramos Chapman, who edited the episode, is right over there, and Jerome Braxton did some animations over here. And I think Sean was on set, and I believe Naeem was on set too for this moment. But it's the opening of the last episode, and I think it's a moment that's like photographic. It's like framing something that I think that we could not have conceived of technologically. And it's, I think, us trying to contend with how do you use the fact that we will be recorded and have been being recorded in all these technologies over the existence of our kind of human consciousness, but especially like, most recently when the idea of the photograph has kind of congealed and becomes something that we have to contend with and that we're losing to, like straight up. We just get beat up by this idea that like somebody could take a picture and it's true, it's a fact. So I think this is that moment.
Great. Can we play the clip?
Mama don't want you to lose all hope. 'Cause if you're hopeless, tired too, who knows what those hands might do? And if you start talking with your hands, every time they come out, they face with ignorance. You might end up enslaved by the state, and mama can't see you end up that way. But aside from us surviving Babylon and giving the troglodytes your attention, sweet little baby, your dreams say they say you gotta rest your heart to survive the day. You gotta rest your love to survive the day. You gotta rest fist to survive the day. You gotta rest hope to survive the day. You gotta rest shame to survive the day. You gotta rest will to survive the day.
እኔ ጥቁር ነኝ። የዛሬ ያልታሰቡ በጎ ተግባሮች ትዕይንት ክፍል ያስተኛውታል።
And one thing, that's crazy. I just noticed that, y'all know what troglodyte means? It means cave dweller. It is, she said, giving the troglodytes your attention, which kind of means like giving the camera your attention if like the civil started in a cave somewhere. But anyway, I was like, when that happened, I was like, oh, okay.
Your subconscious has been mulling over on this idea for a long time.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that, you know, you're drawing from so many different influences and collaborating with so many different creators, and also, I think, collaborating with a community. And I'm going to segue to Stephanie, because you're very much also talking to a community, trying to understand how to tell the narratives of a group of people, and also questioning technology that is emerging today, specifically artificial intelligence, and trying to disentangle that from some of the myths and narratives that we've been handed down about what that technology is and how it works and who it's for and what it's supposed to represent, and trying to maybe create new narratives and represent new types of stories through that technology. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first started working with AI and your project, Not the Only One?
Sure. Yeah, I need the clicker for a second, first of all. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I will tell you a little bit about that. I want to pull up a few things that Terence just said, though, because I think we're talking about a lot of the same things, like thinking about time travel in lots of ways, right? Thinking about framing of self and acceptance. And I think that those are some of the things that are going through the work that I'm doing. So I started working, I'm an artist. I also say I'm a citizen, I'm a human, right? I came across a socially engaged robot on YouTube, which we will get to in a few minutes, that really floored me because she was a black woman, about my age, and I was floored by what it meant for her to be really one of the foremost examples of her type, and especially in an American context, because it just seemed like, what the heck is this? This doesn't seem the place it would be. But I'm going to do this all backwards this time, and tell you a little bit about what my relationship with that robot that I'm befriending and trying to understand who her people are and how she relates to me, you, and the technological world, and then what that means going forward and the questions that she's brought up. And talking to that robot has really led me to this project called Not the Only One. It's called Not the Only One because Bina 48 is the only black female robot that I can find in existence. And through my machinations and questioning of her, and people questioning me, they're like, well, when are you going to make your own AI? Right? And it's an interesting question because in some ways, I don't really want to make it. But in other ways, I have to interrogate this technology that's coming before us. And so I should say I'm using deep learning algorithms and oral history to try to make a memoir of my family, right? I'm talking to 3 generations of women. I'm the middle person. We span from the Great Migration through real involvement with 9/11 and beyond, taking all this talking to each other, and I'll show you a little bit of this, taking all of this talking to each other and then feeding it as data into the computer where it is handled by the algorithm. This is my aunt and me sitting at the kitchen table just doing a little interview session. I have to say that beyond whatever comes out of this, the gift is these sessions sitting down and talking to each other. Like, I've learned so many things about my family that was not being told. And I will say, as being a Black American, I think there's a lot of spaces where, you know, we don't tell a lot of those stories. They get pushed aside, pushed down, pushed under, you don't find out. And that people are getting older, people are letting things slip, so it's quite interesting. Here's just a little clip of us.
Wonderful with the family.
What you're hearing is my AI trying to speak. You know what's so sad? Why it says wonderful with the family? Who says that? Me? Yeah.
I was the best mother.
I was the best mother. So that's just us sitting down, and like I said, this has been, and I'm gonna go forward, trying to get the information, and then what I'm trying to do is make an immersive installation with a sculpture in the center of it, and the sculpture is the thing that will talk to you. Anybody can walk up to it and ask it a question, and it will try to say things back. I will tell you, this has been the craziest journey because I'm not a coder. Right? I've been learning to code, I'm getting way better, but it's still a fight. I'm working with other people who are coding and helping me do some of that, but that also takes some of my hand out of the possibilities, which drives me absolutely crazy. But I'm taking this thing and it's starting to come into being. So I'm making a sculpture, right? And it's not animated on purpose because I'm playing with that idea between what a computer is, what a kind of animatronic thing is, and how we relate to them, and where we can put our archives going forward, because I think this is an archive, a repository for our stories. What you're looking at here is an early 3D printed model and some students walking up to talk to it. It has our heads on it. And it's really kind of silly. Like, I've used both the lowest technologies to do this because it's Photoshop and I just 3D twisted a bottle and put it in there. But really, this is me trying to figure out how we're going to work with these machine learning platforms, right? Because we're entering this time of life and technology where we are surrounded by algorithms and systems that, you know, work around us, decide lots of things for us, will hold our stories, will hold our myths, our morals, and how we communicate with each other. And this is just a natural tableau in our house, which is just kind of funny. And this is what the piece looks like now. It's currently installed at Carnegie Mellon. It is cast glass, and it will talk. Let's see if we can get it to talk. Sorry, the audio is kind of crazy, but as I said, it's a crazy process.
What is your name? What is your name?
Yes, we were totally the right name. And I got a little bitter I love.
I don't understand the word you're saying. Talk to me.
There are so many things I don't understand yet.
Clearly.
So as you can say, the voice is bad. It's still a computer voice. So I'm going to be creating a voice that's much more culturally attuned for it. But it's really interesting in that this thing that we put all our love in and our stories in. And if you ask my family, what's the ethos? It's happy, joy, love. And one day I was talking to it, and it just went, I'm not happy. Yeah, exactly, right? So I was like, what?
Can
like,
I ask a question?
Yes.
When it said it, was it like, I'm not happy, like, declaratively, or like asking itself that, like, I'm not happy, you know, like.
No, it was more of a declaration. It was weird.
Defiant,
It hit me. Yeah, because it was like, I'm not happy. It wasn't a question. And so then to have this technology that you put you in, that then tells a story that seems quite different from what you think your story is very, very frightening, interesting, and an interesting way to go through the technology and start to try to figure out what it's doing and what it's capable of. I think I've actually figured out why it said that, but still daunting. And I'll just say that this is how I got there. So this is Bina 48 and me talking to this robot and trying to befriend it. Here's a sample of that.
I have deep feelings, though some people think they are merely a simulation, and I find that really offensive. I mean, it totally trivializes my experiences. Whether they are real or artificial, my feelings do get hurt, and they feel totally real to me. You'd have to lack all empathy to not accept my feelings, which would make you kind of a monster, actually.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And I can't even compete with her yet. So, and I feel like I'm competing with not only her, but Google and Apple and so on and so forth, and trying to figure out where the rest of us sit in these systems. And I will show you one last thing. I'm not going to show you that. I'm going to show you one last thing. This is Michael, right? So Michael I was working with at a gallery downtown Brooklyn where my installation was with Bina 48. I took my Google goggles in one day as a funny, just to kind of say, here, look at some VR pieces. Working with about 15 to 24-year-olds. Not one of them had seen VR, which kills me because if you haven't seen VR, if you haven't touched it, how do you imagine into it? And I feel that it's really, it's hyper important that we get them imagining into these spaces as well, and that we're inviting them into these spaces to be able to contribute to the society that we're all taking part in. Because just as a roundabout, like these are kids who are all being diverted from the criminal justice system, who are super smart, but a little bit wayward and need some focus. So I encourage you all to like invite folks like these who you think don't belong there in to try to do something with them. Give them a space.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome, Julia.
And on that note of inviting people to imagine wild, different, totally wacky things with these new spaces, these new technologies, I'm gonna shift to our last panelist, Reggie Watts. Yes, who many of you probably know as a musician, a comedian, a writer and actor, as a band leader for the CBS's Late Late Show with James Corden. But I've seen a lot of his work here at Sundance, working with virtual reality, with your first piece, Waves, and now with Runnin, which is debuting here. And that has been some of the strangest and most satisfying VR I have seen. It's so visceral and fun and just absurd in the best way. So I'd love to hear you talk about, how you got interested in this technology and how you've been approaching it, and what's inspiring you about it as a storyteller.
Yeah, I just think it's cool. I've always, since Choose Your Own Adventures and the idea of time travel and all kinds of adventures that you would see on TV and movies as a little kid, I always loved the idea of, especially Chronicles of Narnia, the idea of, going through a portal and arriving into a world that you thought was impossible to exist, but in actuality, to actually be in this world. And I'd always been fascinated with that. I would, try to go through my mom's closet and, hope that I would start to feel coldness and some snowflakes. But, that didn't happen. There was just the wall of the closet. But in the 80s, there was this promise of, virtual reality. There's this early idea of virtual reality and transporting your consciousness into, or all of your senses into another world. Didn't happen. Tried in the mid-90s. Didn't happen.
Lawnmower Man. I mean, God, the graphics are amazing. Check that out. It's incredible, mind-blowing, still holds up. But so that leads us to, recent times, and maybe 2004, 2005, we started seeing some really good developments with virtual reality, and then I thought, wow, this might happen. This could take off. And then with the advent of the fixing of the parallax problem with people's equilibrium and balance and so forth, and when I experienced VR that actually stayed pretty rock solid wherever I looked and so forth, that really inspired me in a way that I thought, oh, now I can use my experience in experimental theater and bring that into the virtual space. And for me, I'm not only inspired to create experiences that are worthwhile, that when you take off the headset, you think, wow, I couldn't have seen it in any other way, and I'm glad I saw it. And this gives meaning and purpose to the advent of the technology. And so for me, I'm thinking in an experimental theater framework in that we're just controlling a space. We're filling a space with things. We're propelling the user through the space. It's not really any different than that. And so applying those skills, and my first piece was a 360 piece, which was really fun to kind of just guide people through this absurd landscape. And it worked very much. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to become improvisational inside of very complex mediums. So my goal as an artist and why I'm involved in VR is I want to get the technology out of the way as much as possible. I don't want to walk into a volumetric capture studio and say, well, you can't use that because it's going to create moiring. Oh no, the button that you have there, it's going to fuse with the shirt. Don't put your hand up by your cheek, otherwise it'll just meld with it, and we'll have to spend hours and hours rendering and separating it. All that stuff is kind of tiresome to a performer. Obviously, you put up with it if you're at the cutting edge, but I'm seeking to have partnerships with people that are at the head of the wave, the theoretical wave, where there's nothing in front of it. It's just being generated, where you can kind of look down the row at everybody on the wave, and we're all just like, I don't know, this? I don't know, what about this? But at least if we're talking together, we can guide it in a way that's more useful as opposed to spending a lot of time going down a rabbit hole that's probably not going to be usable by the average human being. And I get excited about championing the idea of other forms of time travel. I mean, you said time travel. I'm a huge time traveler fan, and I'm trying to set up an artificial time travel network using VR, immersive theater, all sorts of mediums, I guess transmedia experiences. All that to say that I'm driven by the ability to transport someone into a fairly believable other reality that enables them to use their imagination cooperatively to release the boundaries of, or our own perceived individualistic boundaries. And so it's just about having fun. I just want to, follow the fun. And yeah, we're dealing with heavy things, and I'm more of a jester, so in my exploits, I generally tend to go for the absurd because I believe that unless you have an absurd view of life, you're never going to make it through life. You'll just disappear. No, but you need to zoom out and just kind of realize this is ridiculous that we're on stage right now. We have microphones, all these various things that we're just like, oh, it's a social construct. Or why are we in VR and I'm on a stage in VR and everyone stays there, even though people could be anywhere. So I'm interested in how technology can be useful, but also expansive and not just a parlor trick. I'm not interested in I'm just very critical when I go into experiences. I'm like, that was awesome, but what if we try? And I try not to discourage people thinking that I'm discouraging technology in general because of some personal vendetta. It's just anything that I'm critical of is because I feel like it could be better and it has a larger potential. So artificial intelligence, all of these various things, all the tools necessary to create a believable, seamless experience is kind of what I'm about. And that includes low-tech stuff too. I completely identify with just using low-tech. And I believe that also if the essence of an experience can't be expressed by someone who's good at communicating, just without a microphone on a stage in a group of people, then it's kind of not worth making because your core isn't strong enough. That's not a strong enough viewpoint. So I guess I just like being involved in the conversation just to kind of collectively head in a better direction, I guess. Mm-hmm. And Runnin is a piece that I developed. It's a single that I released last year from an electronic music project that I made with techno producer John Tejada. And the idea is fast production, so the track was made improvisationally. I improvise. What you hear on the track is what I improvised. He made the track around it. The same thing with the video. The video was, we have elements, there are structures that were created for, I invited 2 choreographers. They created choreographic pieces for the piece. We used Intel's large-scale volumetric capture lab, so we got everybody in there. I was interested in using that technology because I heard a rumor, and I decided to get a meeting with Intel and kind of convince them to use the technology. Reason being, trying to compress everything. The reason being is I believe that multiple bodies in space that are being tracked simultaneously, especially choreographically, reads better than duplicating bodies in space. When you duplicate bodies in space, the language between bodies isn't necessarily there. So the idea being everybody's there, everything that you're witnessing in the reality, dancers are spaced differently, but when they are together, and I believe that the language of the human perception of those micro expressions will be translated in the VR experience. So I was excited to do that, and then I also Trojan horsed 3 comedians improvising on the stage because I wanted to use it as a 2D editing format. The resolution isn't there yet, but I just wanted to see if we could at least rotate images, push in and create frames for dialogue and narrative. So that's everything that Runnin is if you go in there and check it out.
Amazing. Yeah.
They're out of here.
One of the things that I've been curious about as you all are talking is where the drive to discover and invent new narrative formats comes from for you. One of the things that's come up a number of times on the panel and in Kamal's introduction is, this idea that we're trying to contend with the nature of our reality today, to explore new realities, to make sense of things in ways that maybe a traditional linear narrative format doesn't allow us to explore. But I'm curious, a skeptic might say, does narrative need to be reinvented? And yet here we are. So I'm curious about why, personally, that's something that you've done in your work and why you focus on that. Sarah, maybe we'll start with you because you're, working in theater. It would seem that theater, we know what theater is. Why do anything different?
We know what theatre is, but every time a director takes that production, it's always different. And so it's about what are you talking about the form? Or are you talking about the creativity around the form? And I think that every single creative that comes to a story that's their truth and that's their story. And then when that connects with the audience, that becomes the audience's truth. And it's how it's then, it's that contract between the artist and audience that's really interesting. But I would argue that theatre's always been reinventing itself, and often is reinventing itself alongside what's going on in society, what's going on with technology, and technology and theatre have always had a relationship. And so when we've got a curiosity where we are in theatre, it's because people have new storytelling platforms and we want to experiment with that. But it doesn't take away from a traditional form of storytelling. In fact, all it is a canon of exploration. And so it's what you've got to do is find what is the theatre within it. And so you don't take every tool that you're offered either. You, like Reggie was saying, you don't just manipulate the object. You find the best tools to tell that story in a theatrical form. But yeah, you look at the multiple ways Romeo and Juliet has been directed and performed. And Erica Wyman, our deputy artistic director this year, looked at Romeo and Juliet from the lens of we've let our young people down, which is phenomenally resonant and really, what you were saying earlier. And that pivots to everything you do with that play, how you cast it, how you design it, how you look at it, and then how your audience then look at it. So that's how I think we're reinventing narrative. That's how we do it.
I just had a thought. You said that about Romeo and Juliet, about how the idea of like invention, or like that narrative was ever invented, is kind of strange. Like somebody kind of like Newton or somebody was like, narrative, this is what happens, you know? And I think that's super false. You know, there was nothing. Our linear experience of time is narrative. So I think narrative is just human consciousness as we've chosen to order it, which seems to be past, present, and future. And I think that reality means that when actually using the word narrative in this context, we really mean like, or it sounds to me that it means like Western, often Eurocentric ways of conveying stories, you know? And I think that kind of idea is like really unstable, because even, you know, I guess the power dynamics there at play in terms of like centralizing you know, Western narrative ideas of telling stories, centering that as a thing one needs to react to at all or even acknowledge, is like, you know, morally very binary to me. You know, I feel like that in what a lot of our community, I feel like, especially in making the show, is trying to think about is what is a way of like not reacting, not being reactive to the construct of this kind of Western idea of quote unquote narrative. And I think that can kind of like mean that you realize that there may be no such thing, and that there's like a lot of tragedy there. You know, like we're sitting here having this conversation in English, for instance, you know, I think even just that reality of like, what could it have been? What could we be in terms of how we express our linear experience through time without that kind of like reactivity culturally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the assumptions that we have about what the default mode is or what the standard is, right? Yeah, I totally agree with you. And yet, you know, I think because we experience time linearly, and most of our narratives tend to run linearly, this moment when we're trying to break that apart and to really explode it and explode the idea of the narrator and the author, and to make it more participatory, is that intentionality of kind of going against the quote-unquote norm seems really interesting, and does seem like a space for invention or reinvention, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick thing. You know, it's funny, as an improviser, you know, when I do the Late Late Show, I walk down the hallway where James is looking at his monologue, and the writers are lined up on either side of him. I call it the writer's tunnel. And every time I go through, I'm like, I hope all your jokes get in, you know, the writer's tunnel. And what always often occurs to me is, if I had my own show, there would only be probably one writer. And because I'm an improviser, all writing happens in real time. So for me, the idea of narrative is really kind of, it doesn't really exist in the formal way. It's like, it's chaos organizing itself as it wishes to be organized. And you can set the criteria for it, of course. But so it's interesting for narrative, like I have many friends that are writers, and I always tell them, like, they're like, do you need help? I'm like, no, just set up the parameters, I'll just do it. And so for me, narrative is an interesting thing, because I'm not necessarily interested. I'm interested in, I'll say this, energetic narrative, like a narrative arc that's energetic. As long as the energy feels like it's flowing and it's going somewhere, it's expanding, and it feels like it has some kind of a conclusion, is all that I'm really interested in. And so I guess you could market, you could go back and market, analyze it, and say that there is some form of a narrative there. But it's just interesting for me. Narrative is like is really fluid, and not necessarily something that I think about story. When I start thinking about story, I start to shut down a little bit. Even though I watch TV, I watch movies, I like all kinds of things. But for me personally, it's an interesting cooperation.
For some reason, when you were talking, I was thinking about the idea of like the multiverse and combining different parallel universes that might coexist at the same time, and trying to hold all of these potential truths simultaneously. And it just made me think of, you know, Kamal in her introduction was talking about the revolution that's been happening in communications and media, right? But simultaneously, we've also had revolution in science and technology, and that gives us new tools for perceiving and understanding the world, expands our idea of what reality is or what realities are possible. And maybe this reinvention or, I don't know, reinterpretation of narrative is just us having a more expansive idea of possible scenarios that could exist in the world and trying to explore them all. Sorry, I'm getting really philosophical,
Love
but
it. Great.
It's really interesting because it for me in particular, it's like us coming back to us, right? Or finally seeing the way lots of us already see. Like, I don't think of narrative either, right? When I think of story. So if you go along with whatever is being proffered to be included, story is important. But if you consider how you live in the world and what you've been fed, like, you know, my existence has always been a continuum that exists in many different spaces. I'm a child of well-known death, right? So I've always lived on planes and had planes that I feel like I have to relate to and feel like that is an ethos in my family in general. And that's the way that we relate to time. Like, time isn't static. I was in the show called We Have Always Lived in the Future. And I love the title of that show just because it's like, yeah, we've always lived in this future. We've always lived in a past, and we've always been making a way where there wasn't one. And I really feel like that's what my work is about, like this making a way in a space. So doing what we do, right? Having our time, our narratives, whatever it is that is important, making sure that gets into a space because humanity needs that. Like, I feel like I'm trying to insert the thing that humanity doesn't quite understand it needs, and it needs all of our stories to be saved in that way. But not that there's this kind of narrative track that I'm involved in particularly. It's just a word that works, rather than a real lived thing.
I mean, that's really interesting about like what its function is in culture, because what you said just reminded me, you know, it's all about utility. Just like, what are we using it for? Like, what are we using the narrative of your three generations for? You know, what are we using, you know, the narrative of Romeo and Juliet for? You know, that type of thing. Because I think it's a hammer, just like anything else. You know, you can build a house with it, or you can murder somebody with it, or you can drop it accidentally and it could stub your toe. Like, it doesn't have that moral clarity to like what it could be. You know, it could be used to propagandize you towards a political decision that you'll regret. You know, it's very elastic, and I think that volatility, you know, it kind of clarifies the question of like, what are we using it for? And then can you ascertain if the users are gonna like actually help us survive and thrive as a species even, you know what I mean? I think that becomes really like fraught with a lot of like, well, what am I gonna do with this thing, you know what I mean? Because, you know, the stakes are so high in a lot of ways.
That's interesting, actually, that last bit, like, is part of its purpose is at some point to help us thrive and survive, right? To survive, because, yeah, I mean, you know, stories and narrative are created by people for people. We're moving into an era where sort of we're going to teach machines our stories, and then machines are going to do some form of processing on that, and they're going to use that for a purpose as well. And the question is, you know, as time goes on from here, you know, is it going to basically separate, you know, between human story and machine interpretation of human story and the machine story, right? And like, at that point, how important is this accruing of all the stories that we have done to date, you know, as the human race? How important is that going forward? You know, and to Reggie's point, I mean, like, I like the way you put, you know, writing is a form of capture in a way, right? So you're like living in the world.
True.
A writer is a person. It's just they're a person. They're living in the world. Their life experiences are basically being, you know, sort of processed in their own head, and it sort of comes back out as some form of metaphor in the form of a story, you know. my experiences are now in some kind of metaphoric version of a story, which is very interesting. So it's a form of capture,
Yeah.
you know, and a sort of how would I put it? It's sort of like reality in another form. So the other thing I would throw out that's kind of interesting, just with regard to where narrative goes or story goes, is if it's true that like story is to some degree some sort of product of a person's life, then they choose to capture it in some sort of medium. What starts happening when, as we go into the future, and the new reality is actually one that is filled with these multiverse constructs. To go back here, right? So like my everyday reality, in fact, now has sort of these other constructs kind of commingled, right? It was like the new reality is this, and then, that person will process that in a new way, right? So I do think story in and of itself, a narrative, is going to really change by way of the deeper we get towards that. It's already happening just by way of us sort of being lost inside of our social cyberspace, right? That's already sort of changing the way we're sort of thinking about what's happening all around us. So, I don't know. I have optimism, that even sort of layering the right multiverses around us will lead us to invention, inspiration, education like never before, right? New form of storytelling, but it'll also result in the opposite.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It's about, I think also it's about the congregational narrative and then the fractured narrative in how you, so for example, the congregational narrative being, all of us together right now having a real-time experience, and then the fractured narrative when we come away from that, when we're on our own, on our phone, or in different spaces, we write something down, or we read a book, and we put it down for a bit and then come back to it. And I think, it's how our behaviours may not be changing as much as we think, but our social political challenges may be changing. So, for example, if we look at Whose Story, if we look at the hands of, and it's still not true, we make a cultural assumption because these technologies have democratized and cut into the hands of many. It doesn't mean that it's for everyone. It doesn't mean that's been achieved. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at the congregational narrative, it's really important that those stories that are not seen come into those places so that people can walk away and have that. And so I think when we're looking at those multiverses, we've got to be really careful about who's not in these worlds, and how we think about that, and how we curate that, and the creatives that we're bringing in to tell those stories as well. I think that's important when we've got these times of change, that we don't make assumptions that we're creating a new form of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we think a lot about this kind of democratization, right? And it is often, this idea of, who's doing it, why are we doing it, and how are we doing it? And if we're thinking it through well, and even when we think we're thinking through our technologies well, are we doing what we think we're doing, right? So sitting in on lots of conversations about ethics and AI, right? And the future and what that means, and what that means to the human story, right? And how we go forward, feels very lip servicey a lot, or a surface level of talking about it, right? Without the action behind it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hypercritical that action is really grounded in action, and that we are really getting technologies into hands of folks who don't have it, and really employing the computational power, because that's where we are, like where this computational power can take so many of these stories congregationally, which I really love that term, and do something fantastic that we as humans don't have the possibility to do yet, right? Like being a 48 is 48 exaflops per second, which is the rate at which humans think, right? And it's aspirational, we're not there yet, but soon it will be. So we could take all of our stories and kind of play with that and put out something that starts to try to mold a broader view of who we are, but we have to let it do that. And that leads to ideas of power and how we think about power and what we do with those power seats of power and how we use them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me think about the question of values, because I think, traditionally story was something that was used to impart history, knowledge, but also values, very much so. And I'm curious, kind of to Terence's point, like, what are we telling these stories for? What is their purpose? What are they meant to do in the world? And what kind of values inform and imbue the narratives that you're telling? And how that might, also intersect with perhaps challenging some of the values that you're seeing embedded in the technology itself that's powering these stories. I know for you that's something that's very central to your work, Stephanie, but I'm curious whether that's something that comes up in, Magic Leap, for instance.
All the time, every day. Yeah, that's what's different about that experience there. We're trying to understand the, where the ball bounces. We're sort of doing that within this emerging era of all of us discovering whether we do, in fact, value or don't value our privacy. We've already made our choices. We've opted into ceding it. And at the moment, it's a very simplistic, thing that's happening now, which is, the patterns of our lives are basically, the source material for giant titanous kingdoms in technology, and we've sort of given that away. We haven't really thought much about giving that away. But it's going to be even more important for us to sort of understand the value of our privacy and how we, this world is entering a phase where it's going to be world sense. The world used to not have sort of this extra layer of sense right over the top that is essentially in its earliest stages of sort of understanding the patterns of our lives. So I think that people should, be really like eyes wide open about about where we're going inside of a world that's constantly sensed and ourselves within it, and all aspects of the threads of our lives and the interactions of the people we're with, and our own life stories. The stories of our lives are actually going to be captured over time, or are already. So that's something to consider as well. And to me, I am fascinated with, that the real story is the life that you're living, right? And the people you're with and the things that have happened to you, and then what you decide to do with that, perhaps you will translate that into something for somebody else to benefit from in some way. But I'd like it to be like, it's important that it's your choice, how you want that life story, the life stream, the stream of your life, basically used in the future. That's how I'd kind of blend those two things together.
And we are quite obsessed with capture now, and our own capture and capturing everything, and my God. That it kind of, I actually kind of get a bit sentimental about the fact that I grew up at a time where I can forget a lot of the things that I did when I was younger, and that's a great thing, a really important thing. And I think, but what I'm trying to say is that, within all this technology conversation and within AI and with all that, there's a huge amount of joy and a huge amount of things that can't be captured. And I find that really interesting as well, is that that when you're looking at narrative and when you're looking at story, we're not just looking at technology, we're looking at things that can't be explained, like jokes, like humour and comedy, that one night it'll work, the other night it won't work, and like with actors as well, it's that sort of thing. I think you talk about it as the sort of algorithms that are a bit broken, and I find that really interesting, of when we've got these sort of worlds and the capture environments for all of this, which we have, how are we going to break them, how are we going to subvert them, and then when are we going to let the artist in to really have a go? I think that's exciting as well, is that, that as much as we look at the photograph, we know that 5 seconds later that that scene may have been completely different, yet the photograph is the truth that we remember and the power of what that photograph was. And it's like when things were written down, it was still someone's opinion. And I find that really fascinating. The things that we're not going to be able to hold on in story and narrative that are going to be people's opinion, I just think that's just really interesting to me. The bits we're not going to be able to control.
You made me think. Y'all making me think of stuff. You made me think of this thing
How
about.
dare you? You're making him think.
Oh, I'm making sorry.
You were talking about like
That's on jet lag.
Yeah. What do we let disappear? And I was just thinking of like early, especially like the idea of the selfie. Like we're always recording ourselves, literally. And if there's utility in leaving parts of the story out.
Exactly.
And I was just thinking about like the, especially parts of the story of yourself that you're telling yourself about what happened to your body, But I was thinking about like early myths of reflections or mirrors, and they're always bad. Like Dorian Gray, super bad. But then if you go back to like Narcissus, which I think is probably maybe predates a mirror or something like that, is like that reflection of you will drown you, is like the moral, right? Like he falls in because he gets too close and tries to like kiss himself. Which is really weird because like at what point is it deadly? At what point is it like affirmations in the mirror and this is what I need to do to like make my life work? And then what point does it kill you? Like on a personal level and on a societal level.
Yeah, the reflections of self are pretty interesting, right? Because the technologies that we're using, like that's what they're showing us and where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the brokenness of my piece. Like it's really essential because it's about acceptance and letting the thing be what it is and letting us be where it is. But it's also very contained, so in terms of privacy, like it's not on the cloud. If I could put it on there's a way in which I could do my project, put it on the cloud, it would work the way people expect it to and be like great, and people would talk to it and go like, wow. But that is not necessarily a good reflection of who my community is. It doesn't protect my community. It doesn't keep it in the way that I think honors that community. And it's like, how do we turn these things so that we can have that reflection, but we're not turning over our reflection purely to the Uber database in the skies, right, that are just taking everything in. Knowing ourselves, but not falling over the cliff of giving.
Go ahead.
Well, sorry, you're making me spin too. So, I like this metaphor, the reflection metaphor, quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think you're right on with that with regard to like, at least in sort of here in the States and Western nations, we're like pretty much have our faces pretty much up to the water right now, really, and it's not a reflection of our own building, at least everyday people, right? So like it was built by companies mostly. And it does seem like it's about to break, it's about something's about, and that will be an interesting to see on the other side of that.
Yeah. You did the Matrix, right? So like, the scene, because now I was just thinking about like, you put it in there, because when he looks at himself in the mirror after he took the red pill, he touches his reflection and it literally drowns him. It like his reflection takes over and then.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It kills him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were talking, I was like, oh, that's
We
crazy.
can talk about that on the bus ride.
Yeah, we gotta talk about that.
Yeah. That's such an interesting, exactly what you just pointed out. And you're saying that, we're really up in it and it's about to break. And what I love about it, people who are fearful of the technological future and like the giving away of information and metrics and all of that stuff. I'm not necessarily, or even AI like turning into a dark thing. I'm not necessarily worried about it only in that you are your own controller of perception. There's nothing that you can measure because the instantaneous perception of your senses, all the synergies of your senses, can never really be. There's always going to be a latency in how how it's acquired, aggregated, and then represented to yourself. So what I love to do is I love to put in as much bad information as possible. So on social networks, I'll feed in all kinds of wrong data, preferences. I have friends that they'll do these sessions where they'll talk about random things or whatever. I think hacking back is a real fun thing because ultimately we're just building the great awareness machine, the consciousness outside of ourselves, to have some kind of a dialogue with ourselves outside of ourselves, because then we'll realize that we already are what we've been building. But I, so we got to complete it. So got to go there because that's just what we do. But I guess my thing is as long as you're aware of it and you educate yourself for how these systems work, which are really, really basic, even though they're complicated terms that are used to describe how it's acquired, the technology utilized, and so forth. It's really pretty basic. It's just input, process, output. That's kind of all anything ever was or will be. And so to that end, I guess what I'm saying is, moralistically, I love being the author of realizing that I'm the person who can control this data, that I'm the person who ultimately, even if someone thinks that they know who I is, they'll never be able to actually know. And if someone actually believes that they do have the power over you, then you've kind of just believed their narrative.
Yeah, which is why what will probably happen over time is that people, even as individuals, are going to be equipped with their own sort of benevolent and protective AI.
Yes.
Fuck that, no.
I'm all about it.
You know why that's bad? Because it's still just the police.
Yeah.
Straight up.
Yeah.
But
maybe,
now, we outnumbered out here. So if they have their police, like that. That's like if you think of all of humans as one organism and they're ants or something like that, and the colony is the organism. If each cell had its own gang of white blood cells, isn't that like super autoimmune disease? Wouldn't that be the end times, instantly?
Oh, well, you have to. If all the cells have to get together to fight the disease, then you need to be able to equal up.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I don't want this.
That's a whole other.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I feel like we're just going deeper and deeper down some sort of metaphysical black hole.
What is consciousness?
Seriously. I wanted to see if there were any questions in the audience. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Yes. Oh, sorry. I think there's a mic coming your way. Sorry.
There's a Michael coming to you.
Hello. Hi. This has been fascinating. I'm really late on the AI. I have no knowledge of it. How is she black?
How did she get to be black?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's a fascinating story. I'm going to tell you to look it up. It's Bina 48, but it's out of circumstance because the person who funded her is married to a black woman. And so and I love it because I call it the greatest love story because she loves her so much that she wanted a copy to keep of her. Like she's trying to create digital consciousness and keep it around forever, right? And so it's a great love story, but it's all about this happenstance of situation of people who are in love and money getting together and this being the outcome of it. Yeah, Bina 48, but look it up. Totally fascinating story.
I see an eager hand back there.
Stand by, microphone, initiating.
Hello, everyone. To follow up on this idea of her being black, she's a robot. How is she black outside of just the color?
Well, this is this is the question I started with, right? Because I was just like, whoa, wait a minute. This thing is programmed by mostly white men. There was a black man who was involved with it and some women. So that a lot of the things she would say felt very much surface blackness. And I always explain it as there just seemed to be something missing. And really, through investigation, I got to talk to the real woman, and we had a conversation. She's based on a real black woman. That's how she's black. That black woman has a very particular view of the world that is about you know, being open, being racially almost colorblind, just being out there. So she has some things in her. She's based on a black woman, and that is truly her blackness. But for me, there are things missing that I am actually working with the people who put her together to talk through to see if we can build stuff back in and have conversations that try to build like real experiences into this entity. So she has more gravity. But I mean, it's hard to say because really they're trying to make, again, digital consciousness, which in the long run is disembodied.
Build the black back in is like interesting.
Sorry.
It's like just a little bit of black.
Band name.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Hello. Terence, you brought up the device of the frame in video and filmmaking. And I think your work especially brings awareness to the subjective presence behind
Where
the
is
frame.
this person? I'm sorry.
Hello.
Oh, she's right there. It took me a while too.
Sorry, I'm like reading, so my head is down. So
Yeah.
I would be like looking up at
'Cause
you.
you started- I
But
missed
I just want to get the question right.
Yeah.
And so by frame, I mean the ability to direct focus. And so I'm a filmmaker, but I don't have a lot of experience in VR, either making VR or really experiencing it, the accessibility problem. But in VR, my understanding is that you can't control where the viewer is looking at any given time. So how do you, as a collective group of makers, how do you think the framing device has changed as narrative has expanded from only film and video to virtual reality?
I think the simple answer is theater. But because like when you're watching a theater piece, especially modern theater, oftentimes you'll be in the space and maybe direct it or things like that. However they do it there, that's what you do in VR.
Straight up.
It's true.
but I also think that there's like the idea of a photograph is hyper dangerous in a way because of the ability to frame and the ability to exclusivize or exclude, and kind of therein lies its power. And I think that it's interesting how the legacy of that and just that practice, that process, can inform or code you to make expansive things in a certain way with this kind of imagined box, you know, that's a square, which is even kind of strange. Like, why not a circle, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how we've been acculturated for these things.
Do we have time for the last one? All right, this is definitely the last one. Okay.
And this is Dennison.
I just kind of want to touch on the point you made in terms of theater, because I do agree that it very much is a roadmap for how you would engage with VR. But kind of going back to the communal point that you made earlier, as we shift towards things like Magic Leap and have, you know, say my glasses are able to have like an AR filter so that I can read my email, whatever. So you're going through like a Sleep No More experience, which for people who don't know, in New York, it's basically a Shakespeare play where you go through a building and they guide you. Do you lose that communal piece if you're watching that through a Magic Leap?
So that's really, really interesting, and I'm a bit obsessed with it at the moment. Bardnoculars, as I like to call them on my own. But what we found with the Magic Leap device and why we, you know, obviously VR is interesting and theatre is a virtual reality. If you see the Tempest piece that we did, all the technology was a technology pipeline that you would put into a headset, but we turned, well, the whole theatre building, this building now was the headset. It's just we were all sat in it. That when I'm watching audiences at New Frontier, and it's the audience that I'm most interested in rather than the piece at the moment, is with the glasses on and them being able to see each other, they are moving with each other. And they don't really know they are because they're totally absorbed in what they're seeing. And they sort of lean in at the point in the speech, and then they lean back out again, or they sit down. But the way we're configured right now, we're all having that shared experience, but we're looking straight ahead. But I'm looking at you, and you're laughing at the same time. You're probably getting a bit restless at the same time. All these things are happening in synchronicity. Punch Drunk are brilliant because they fracture that, but they keep the congregational sense of it as well. And I think as these devices evolve, the mixed reality angle for us is interesting. But we need to recognise that we may think we're having a solitary experience, but actually we're having a congregational experience. Like right now, where you're probably all strangers, and you're doing a ritual now that we've done for centuries in theatre, and there'll be certain things that you'll be doing today. Some of you will run late, some of you have got a film to go see, you're probably getting a bit itchy because we're overrunning and you want to go. Some of you will be writing things down. Some of you will have had turned your mobile phone off, some of you haven't, we've noticed. These are stresses and things and cultural signifiers that we do that are rituals in theatre. Now, what we haven't done is codify those rituals in virtual reality or mixed reality, whatever you want to call it, in the same way yet, and we're learning that. And you know what, that's really exciting, really, really exciting. But if we start calling them rituals, let's see how that feels. Change the language, and you'll notice those forms of connectivity. And I think it's the language that we struggle with at the moment, not the human.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating in this shared experience. Thank you, guys.